Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and AP English, and we turn in our study now of the Iliad to book 11, what Fagles calls Agamemnon's Day of Glory. Some will focus on the Aristeia, we've used that term before, that battle scene, series of moments when the fighting is best focused on a single warrior. Some will focus there. Others will focus on the end of this book, namely the idea that at the end of this book, Achilles is going to be watching the defeat of the Greeks. He gets what he wanted. He asked his mama Thetis about it. And then ultimately, he's going to make this really darkly ironic suggestion to Patroclus. We'll get there. Now, if you haven't been watching my lectures, make sure that you get to learnstrong.net and go down that left-hand side, find the AP folder, and pay attention to the earlier lectures of 1 through 10, books 1 through 10, just to review really quickly to get you back on board. I like to do this at the beginning of every lecture. We'll do this for every one of these lectures. At Iliad 1, remember the invocation of the Muse, and Achilles and Agamemnon have their falling out, which start all this insanity. At Iliad 2, we've got Agamemnon's bad dream, as we sometimes refer to it, where Zeus convinces him that everything's going to be well, and the Greeks are going to win. And we also have the catalog of the ships and the chariots. In book 3, we've got Paris versus Menelaus, and it looks like the battle is over because Menelaus has defeated Paris. But in book 4, Zeus is convinced by Hera, no, let this thing happen, and then Pandarus will shoot Menelaus an arrow, not kill him, but wound him, and then we're back on in war again. Book 5 is Diomedes' famous Aristeia, where he will in fact wound both Aphrodite and Ares. Leading to book 6, that's that pivotal book, where Hector will go back into the walls of Troy and will visit for the last time with his wife Andromache and his young son Astyanax. Then in book 7 we have Ajax versus Hector, and they come to some kind of mutual truce because they're the two great warriors that cannot defeat each other. In book 8 we have Zeus and his famous scales. And then, of course, the decision is made that the Trojans will begin, especially Hector, to jack the Greeks. In book 9, Agamemnon realizes he needs Achilles back. He sends the famous embassy of Odysseus and Phrynox and Ajax to ask him to come back, and Achilles says no. And in that moment, he is, of course, going to say, I no longer want nor need Team A, Scooby Snacks, and Kleos glory. No honor, no glory. I then gave a review of books 1 through 9. I call that Achilles' Crisis of Faith, where I comment on the fact that Achilles is I think, very complicated character, and we talk about his rejection of both Team A and Kleos is significant for the remainder of the text. In book 10, we have that famous night fighting scene between Diomedes and Odysseus, where they go out and they kill Dolan and chop his head off and steal the ponies and kill a bunch of Thracians. Now we turn to book 11. My hope, of course, as I've said always, is that you're doing your own annotative work and reading on your own and then coming to my lecture here to help you. Reminding you our learning theory asks that we're connecting new information to old information in meaningful ways. In annotative work, we of course do that through our 3 levels of reading. What does the text say? What does the text mean? How do I relate to the text? At 2A, messages, themes. What does the text mean? At 2B, the rhetoric. And here we focus primarily at 2B on symbolism and irony. Pay attention and set it up right now. This, many scholars have argued, is the most ironic text of all of the Iliad. We'll get to why later. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this text? 3A, other texts, especially the precedent books of the Iliad. And then finally, how can I relate to this personally in some kind of meaningful way? How can I own this? As I think I said in earlier lectures, there are people who see some of these books in the middle of the Iliad as kind of like, not a waste of time, but they're kind of throwaway books. They're not that important. I disagree entirely, and I'm going to make the argument even here. This is a book you really want to pay close attention to, especially for what happens at the end of the book. Let's do a real quick brief summary, and then we'll get to some lines as we always do. Again, we'll begin with Agamemnon's Aristeia, his battle glory. Zeus makes some decisions early on, telling the Greeks this is going to be bad news. He rains blood, and panic in the Greek ranks ensues. We got a lot of fighting, we got a lot of killing. Agamemnon will show no mercy whatsoever, and we'll get all the way to the Scaevan gates at Troy. Zeus then will send Iris, the messenger goddess, to tell Hector, stay away from Agamemnon until he's wounded, and then that will be your signal. That's exactly what happens. We then will have another invocation of the Muse to tell the story, the killing story again at line 253. We then will have Agamemnon wounded by Kun, and Agamemnon will return the favor and kill Kun, but he is wounded and then he has to leave, which will lead then to Hector surging in the battle. Odysseus and Diomedes then will come together to fight against the Trojans, and Paris will wound Diomedes with an arrow, which is of course ironic because it will be Paris's arrow that ultimately will kill or take down Achilles, not in the Iliad, but after the Iliad, right? And as well, Paris will taunt him, which is kind of course, ironic as well, because Paris, if he ever makes it into any of these books, he's usually kind of seen as wimpy and all of that, and then, you know, he likes to taunt somebody that he's jacked. Diomedes, however, will say, and for those of the Monty Python fans in the house, "'Tis but a scratch." This is where it comes from. Diomedes will say, "I got an arrow through my foot. Big deal. It's nothing." Odysseus saves Diomedes, and Diomedes has to leave. Odysseus then is on his own, surrounded. He still fights, ultimately saved by Athena, and we then have Ajax's Aristeia battle scene. Paris will then wound Machaon. Machaon is the healer, and this is a big deal for a number of reasons. There's all kinds of ironies associated with his wounding. Nestor will then have to save Machaon, will take him back to the camp. Zeus then will force Ajax to retreat. He will block the Trojans. Eurypylus will save Ajax, wounded himself by Paris, and all of this Achilles is watching. Importantly, he will send or ask for Achilles, will ask for Patroclus, and in line 714, he will say, "I need you to go and talk with Nestor about the wound of our healer Machaon." And many have argued that line 714, we'll get there, is without question maybe the most ironic line of all of the Iliad. From that moment on, his doom was sealed, is the line. Obviously a vague antecedent to the pronoun his, right? We're talking Achilles' doom was sealed. We're talking Patroclus' doom was sealed. Well, we'll talk about it. Then we have Patroclus with Nestor. This is really important stuff at the end of this book. Nestor will give his Aristeia in flashback. He'll tell us about when he was a young man and how amazing a fighter he was. This is Nestor, the old man, always talking about, you know, his younger days, and he wishes that he could be young again. He reminds Patroclus that in fact Nestor was the one that actually brought or invited both Patroclus and Achilles to Troy. He tells Patroclus, "You need to go back and tell Achilles he's got to return to the fighting, and if he says no, then you need to yourself enter the war and go ahead and put on Achilles' armor." Patroclus is excited when he hears this suggestion. On his way back to Achilles, by the way, in that little exchange, we also find out that Patroclus is actually older than Achilles, often thought of as the inverse, and that somehow Achilles is taking care of Patroclus as the young man. That is not the case in the Iliad. Patroclus is actually older. However, Achilles is obviously the great warrior, right? On the way back, Patroclus will try to help the wounded Eurypylus, and now all of a sudden, and then we'll say this at the very end of our lecture, now all of a sudden, the war becomes real to Patroclus. He sees the pain, he sees the suffering, he sees the wounding, and now he's ready to step in and he's going to do something. And obviously he will do something, and that will happen later on in the Iliad, and obviously that will lead to his death, and obviously that will lead to Achilles returning, and obviously that will lead to Hector's death, and obviously that will lead to the end of the Iliad. Right? Okay, let's go to some key lines here, as we are often wont to do. I love to look at opening lines because these opening lines in each of these books are so powerful. Let's go ahead and look at the opening lines here. Now, the poet tells us, "Now dawn rose up from bed by her lordly mate Tithonus, and bringing light to immortal gods and men. But Zeus flung strife on Achaea's fast ships." Now, of course, we go back to an earlier lecture about the judgment of Paris, and what all that led to was, of course, Iris, the goddess of discord, strife and discord, throwing an apple in and all of that kind of thing. By the way, note that in the Greek, Iris, the goddess of discord or strife, sounds a whole lot like Eros, which is, of course, love. Fascinating how those two come side by side sometimes. But Zeus flung strife on Achaea's fast ships. The brutal goddess flaring his storm shield, his monstrous sign of war in both her fists. She stood on Odysseus' huge black-bellied hull, moored midline, so a shout could reach both wings upshore to Telamon Ajax's camp, as well as down to Achilles'. Trusting so to their arms' power and battle strength, they'd haul their trim ships up on either flank. There, strife took her stand, raising her high-pitched cry, great and terrible, lashing the fighting fury in each Achaean's heart. No stopping them now, mad for war and struggle. Now suddenly battle thrilled them more than the journey home, than sailing hollow ships to their dear native land. By the way, hollow here is an important word for an adjective. Hollow ships meaning they don't get all the Scooby Snacks team out of Troy. That is clear in very subtle ways is what most of these Greeks, if not all these Greeks, are actually here to fight for. They want as much stuff as they can get out of that city of Troy. We then have Agamemnon's Aristeia. By the way, this Aristeia concept, you see it perfectly outlined here. I don't have time to read it. I wish I did, but I don't have time. You have always the dressing for battle. Usually a celebration of armor is involved in that, right? And it goes into all kinds of detail. Then you have the fighting and the killing that ensues. Then you usually have a wounding that will occur, and somehow the leaving of the battle. It's fascinating about this wounding thing. We don't have, in the Iliad, scholars have pointed out many times, we don't have that kind of wound where you lay around for 5 or 6, 7 days and things get worse and then you die. In the Iliad, you either are jacked and you're dead, or you're jacked with a wound that you can come back from. Okay, and that's usually what happens in an Aristeia. And then usually the fighter will return, and once returning, either is a hero and kills, or is killed, or both, right? Okay. We then will get Zeus raining blood. This is line 60. But Zeus drove a swirl of panic deep in the Greek lines, and down from the vaulting skies released a shower, raining blood. For Zeus was bent on hurling down to the house of death a rout of sturdy fighters. That notion of Zeus was bent on hurling down to the house of death a rout of sturdy fighters ought to sound familiar, because it's actually the opening lines from the Iliad. The opening lines again. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous doom that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls. The same line is echo here, only here it's Zeus who was bent on hurling down. So it's not the rage of Achilles, but rather it's Zeus's edict that all these Greek soldiers are going to die, all right? And then we're told a little bit later that that Zeus himself is sitting, is watching all of this, but we're told at line 87 or so, the other gods kept clear at their royal ease. So get the picture of this. These men are just slaughtering each other, and there are the gods sitting up on Mount Olympus, eating ambrosia and just kind of relaxing, sitting at royal ease, reclining off in the halls where the roofs of each were built for the ages high on rugged-ridged Olympus. And all were blaming Zeus with his storming dark clouds because the Father decreed to hand the Trojans glory. But the Father, Zeus, paid no heed to them, could care less what the gods think. Retiring peaks apart from the other gods, he sat aloof, glorying in his power, gazing out over the city walls of Troy and the warships of Achaea, the flash of bronze, fighters killing, fighters killed, the famous line. Fighters killing, fighters killed. This notion that Zeus is kind of a god apart is a fascinating idea as well. Hera and Athena obviously are really upset that this is happening, right? We then have Agamemnon and his kills, and the scenes here are really vivid and violent. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Line 105. And right in the midst sprang Agamemnon, first and killed a fighter, Binor, veteran captain. Then his aide Ulius, lashing on their team. Down from the car he leapt, squaring off, charging in full fury, full face, straight into Agamemnon's spearhead, ramming sharp. The rim of the bronze helmet could not hold it. Clean through heavy metal and bone. The point burst, and the brains splattered all inside the cask. So, you kind of get this idea of, and again, back to this notion of the wounds, right? You either get wounds where you're dead, or you get wounds where you're wounded, but you're going to come back pretty quickly, and you're going to be okay. The next section that I want to concentrate on here is we got some brutal war descriptions that happen, and Agamemnon ends up then in front of a couple that are pleading for their life. I'm at line 150. Agamemnon ramped up into their faces like a lion, both fighters shouting from their chariot, pleading, "Take us alive, Atreides. Take a ransom worth our lives. Vast treasures are piled up in our father's house, bronze and gold and plenty of well-wrought iron. Father would give you anything, gladly, priceless ransom, if only he learns we're still alive in Argive's ship. So in other words, we have an example of here, Agamemnon with these young kids, and they're begging for their lives. So they cried to the king, cries for mercy, but only heard a merciless voice in answer. He is mad at the father. Cunning, he says, Agamemnon. So you're the man's sons. Once in the Trojan council, he ordered Menelaus there on an embassy joined by King Odysseus. We've heard about this earlier, right? Murdered right on the spot. No safe conduct back to the land of Argos. In other words, their father tried to murder Menelaus. You're his sons. Now pay for your father's outrage, blood for blood. And he pitched Pisander off the chariot onto earth and plunged a spear into his chest. The man crashed on his back as Hippolochus leapt away. But him he killed on the ground, slashing off his arms with a sword, lopping off his head, and he sent him rolling through the carnage like a log. And he left them there for dead, just at the point where most battalions scattered. Agamemnon charged the rest of his troops in armor quick behind him now. Infantry killing infantry, fleeing headlong, hard-pressed, drivers killing drivers, under the onrush, dressed in whirlwinds, driven up from the plain, hooves of stallions, rumbling thunder, bronze blaze, immense slaughter, and always King Agamemnon whirling to kill, crying his Argives on, breakneck on, like, and now we have an epic simile, like devouring fire roaring down onto dread, dry timber, squalls hurling it on, careening left and right, and brush ripped up by the roots, goes tumbling under, crushed by the blasting fire impinging on. So, again, the epic simile begins with the word like or as and then ends with so. So under Atreides' onslaught, Trojans dropped in flight. Stampedes of massive stallions dragged their empty chariots clattering down the passageways of battle. Stallions yearning to feel their master's hands at the reins, but there they lay, sprawled across the field, craved far more by the vultures than by wives. I mean, I don't know that you can find a more remarkable passage that describes the horror of fighting and war, and yet no, this is elevated language, obviously, that's playing that game. Well, Zeus is concerned about Hector. He sends down Iris to Hector, and he says through the messenger at line 233, Hector, son of Priam, a mastermind like Zeus, the father has sped me down, again this is Iris saying it, has sped me down to tell you this, so long as you see Lord Marshal Agamemnon storming among the champions, mowing columns down in blood, you must hold back. Command the rest of your men to fight the enemy. Stand their headlong charge. But soon as the spear or bowshot wounds the king and Atreides mounts his chariot once again, as soon as Agamemnon's wounded, then Zeus will hand you the power to kill and kill, till you cut your way to the bench ships, and the sun sinks, and the blessed darkness sweeps across the earth. Okay? So in other words, look for the sign. Then the poet at line 253 will say, sing to me now, you muses, who hold the halls of Olympus. Who was the first to go up against King Agamemnon? Who of the Trojans are famous Trojan allies? So again, another invocation of the muse. We now have a series of battles that we'll move through rather quickly. The first one that I want to talk about is the Trojan warrior Kun, who will wound Agamemnon. I'm at line 288. But Kun marked him, Agamemnon. Kun, Antor's eldest son, a distinguished man-at-arms, and stinging grief went misting down his eyes for his fallen brother. In from the blind side he came. Agamemnon never saw him. Tensed with a spear and slashed Agamemnon under the elbow, down the forearm, a glint of metal. The point ripped through his flesh, and the lord of fighting men Atreides shuddered. Not that he quit the foray even then. He sprang at Kun, gripping his big spear shaft, tough from the gusting wind that whipped its tree. Kun was just dragging his brother's foot first, wild now to retrieve his own father's son, calling for help from all the bravest men. But as Kun hauled the body of his brother, right, the corpse, through the press, Agamemnon lunged up under his boss shield, thrust home hard with the polished bronze point, unstrung his limbs and reared and lopped his head, and the head tumbled onto his fallen brother's corpse. And then, and there, under royal Agamemnon's hand, the two sons of Antenor filled out with their fates, and down they plunged to the strong house of death. We then will have the wounding of this Agamemnon, leading him to leave. And that, of course, becomes the signal at line 330 for Hector. There, Hector's signal. Seeing Atrides hurt and speeding off the lines, he gave a ringing shout to his troops and allies. Trojans, Lycans, Dardan fighters, hand to hand, now be men, my friends. Call up your battle fury. Their best man cuts and runs. Zeus is handing me glory, awesome glory, Kleos, in other words, right? Drive your horses right at these mighty Argives. Seize the higher trumpet. Seize it now. Hector, whipping the fight and firing each man like huntsmen. Notice this simile. Like huntsmen crying on his hounds, their white fangs flashing. We have a lot of similes that have to do with dogs in this book, by the way. Harrying savage game, some wild boar or lion. So, at Achaea's ranks, he drove his fearless Trojans. Hector, son of Priam, a match for murderous Ares. The prince himself went wading into the front lines, his hopes soaring, and down he hurled on the fray like a sudden killer squall that blasts down on the dark blue sea to whip and chop its crests. So we've got Hector and his signal now, and he's coming in. The next place I want to focus is at line 360. Now, there would have been havoc, irresistible chaos, fleeing bands of Achaeans flung back to their ships if Odysseus had not shouted out to Diomedes. So we're back to these two, right? What's wrong with us forgetting our battle fury? Come here, old friend, stand by me. What humiliation if Hector with the flashing helmet takes our ships? Powerful Diomedes took his challenge quickly and says, I'll stand and fight by God and take the worst but little joy it will bring our comrades now. Zeus, the king of the clouds, has pitched on victory for the Trojans, not for us. Diomedes realizing that, of course, this is all going to go sideways very quick. We then have at line 390 this very fascinating, I mean, there's this back and forth, this mantic arts is mentioned. And then at line 390 it says, and there, gazing down from his ridge on Ida, the mountain, the son of Cronos, Zeus, stretched the rope of battle, tense and taut, as the fighters kept on killing side to side. The idea that there's like a rope that's involved, and it's like a tug of war, we might think of, right? Okay, and that's kind of an interesting symbol you might jot down at 2b. We then have Hector, who, because Diomedes throws a spear at him and hits him in the head,